Hey, I'm Joe Levy, and this is Auriculum, an occasional podcast that accompanies Robert Christgau's And It Don't Stop newsletter on Substack. Although if we keep up the current pace, and people, there are no promises here. Soon enough, occasional could actually become monthly. So I'm the editor and also the album collage artwork master for And It Don't Stop. And I'm joined today by Mr. Don't Stop himself, Bob Christgau. Hey, Bob.
How you doing, Joe?
I'm doing well. And also let me note, we are joined, and I say this with all humility, by Bob's favorite and most respected editor, which would be his wife, Carola DeBell.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here.
Bob and Carola are going to talk about their ballots for the 2020 edition of the Rolling Stone 500. This is the third time that Rolling Stone has run this poll. The first was in 2003 when I had the job of editing that thing. And then in 2012, when I was blissfully free of said job. And now in 2020, when I am still free of the job of editing that thing, that would be the great Christian horde at Rolling Stone. So the voters in this poll included artists, people in the music business, and rock critics. And let me say the voting rolls have been expanded for the current edition in ways that did shake things up a bit. There's more Beyonce and Fiona Apple than ever before, so hooray. Kate Bush is now on the list, so okay. And if you're using the search function on this list, you will find both Drake and Nick Drake. Also, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is no longer the greatest album of all time. That would be Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. But before Bob tells us how much he dislikes that album,
I don't dislike it. I just think it's overrated. I
just think it's overrated. You don't like it.
I don't like its reputation.
Oh, okay. All right.
It's what he says to me. It's overrated. He doesn't say he doesn't like it in the privacy of our home.
All right. So before Bob tells us how overrated that album is, we are going to talk a little bit about lists in general and about how the two of you put together your ballots, which were posted on And It Don't Stop in September. You were asked to vote for 50 albums, and I want to talk about how you both approached this. But Carola, you're not a list maker, so tell me a little bit about what this was like for you.
Yeah, I was remembering years ago, Ann Powers, who really ought to have been super confident, said that she stayed up at night worrying about her Passenjop list. And I always wondered, well, is that a guy thing? The list making, ranking things? I don't know.
Definitely, it's a guy thing. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I don't like to too much generalize because I think there are some female rock critics who probably would really have fun doing it. But for me, it's like constantly changing my mind. And in addition, I thought I had to do it in order. I had to rank it. And it turns out I didn't really have to rank it. But
all you have to do about that sort of thing is say no. That's all
I know,
you have to
but
do.
You have the confidence to do that. I didn't feel that way. I felt like, I have to. So I did some ranking as well as some compiling. The first thing was we just jumped in and listened to whatever seemed like, here's a candidate, here's another candidate.
So just to be clear, we're talking about the field is wide open and you're like, well, let's just start listening to records to figure out which are our 50 favorite and or the 50 greatest of all time. As you were saying earlier, you have listened to most of what Bob has written about, if not everything Bob has listened to and written about over the last 5 decades or so. So you are a rock critic yourself, novelist and fiction writer, perhaps more actively those things now than a rock critic, but you've done a lot more listening than you have music writing.
Yes, I was very influenced by rock criticism when I first encountered Cream, and I knew Bob already, but sort of what the approach was. And one of the things that I thought was great was that the subjective was valued. So you wouldn't be saying, okay, well, I like this, but I know that doesn't qualify for top 50. Now, I think things have changed, or may have. But back then, it was like, if you weren't a fan of that record, you didn't understand it in some way. So I tried to bring that concept into how I thought about records. But at the same time, I didn't want to be completely ridiculous. So I ended up putting the Moldy Peaches in the category of I love it. In addition, there was the question of, oh, my favorite Aretha song is You Send Me. And it's on an album that's not necessarily her greatest album. So then I thought, well, I'm going to put it on. What, I'm just going to put it on. And I felt a little bit like, we all think more about voting than we used to. I was thinking, when I voted for the New York primaries, Joe Biden was already going to be the candidate. I said, well, I'm going to vote for Elizabeth Warren. What does it matter? He's going to be the candidate. I want the pleasure of voting for Elizabeth Warren.
You could have written in Kimya Dawson from the Moldy Peaches, I suppose, at that point.
Yeah. So anyhow, all these things were very interesting to me to think about in making my selections. And part of it is now it's all over and you say, well, why didn't you do this or that? Then I'm saying, why didn't I do this or that? Well, I should have. So.
Well, there's always time to, apologize to the Roaches or anyone who may have. For the younger listeners, they do spell it ROCH with an E.
That's because that's their name.
Yeah, Bob, I know.
It's very, very reasonable.
It's also a joke they make in the opening track on their first record. But just to step on the punchline. Exactly, that's the one. If you sing it, we may have to pay royalties. Okay, yeah, now we have to pay royalties. But Bob, just to be clear, there are categories, there are things you like, there are things that are great, there are things that are the greatest of all time. But you guys took this seriously because we posted both your lists, your ballots, and a work list of things that you listened to while you were putting these together. So you went back to check things out.
Well, yes. For starters, every day we have breakfast, and I ask Carola what she wants to hear. Listening to music with Carola is an extraordinarily important part of my whole critical process. I think she has incredible ears and was a terrific rock critic when I can force her to do it. Let me say that all of her rock criticism is on my site in the little part below. Irish Catholic, what a great one.
Yeah, that was good.
We Condemn the Gang of Four, what a great one. And there are many others. I can't recommend her writing more highly, even though I often had to put the endings on her pieces as her editor. Or another, as she was just admitting at breakfast this morning, very important part of my critical process is when I'm in the dining room with her and the music is on and Carola says, what's that? Once she starts to notice something, then I know that it's very likely that what she's hearing there is going to be important to me. We may not feel exactly the same, but she is my best ears. She's her great ears.
So recently, I think you pointed out that one of your top albums of last year, Hanging Tree Guitars, was an album that you had that experience with.
That's right. Carola was into that record before I was.
Yeah, definitely. And one part of that, one of the what's that, is that it had this quality that it sounded new every time. So when I was saying, what's that? I was also literally saying, what's that? It's that kind of record, that kind of material.
So in any case, I was working on the top 50 and, 2 or 3 weeks immersing in literally hundreds of records that we at least sort of liked or really liked and remembered well. And then Christian Hort, who's an old friend of both of ours, known since he was a kid who gave up Harvard Law School to become a rock critic, suggested that Carola be a voter as well as myself. And what a wonderful thing to do for us, because then we spent it was at least 2 weeks.
It was 2 weeks, yeah.
trying to figure out, saying, oh, what about this one? How does that one sound? And as I describe in the piece I wrote about it for Anna Don't Stop, towards the end, we played Wire's Pink Flag and Brian Eno's Another Green World. Now, these were both records that we loved in the late 70s. We were both really deeply into punk. The Wire is sort of an ultra-punk record, and Another Green World is a completely sui generis record of a sort that Eno never made before or since.
But punks liked it.
And so they were both sort of marginal records. And we sat there, and they're both about 45 minutes. We sat in the living room for an hour and a half, completely spellbound by both of those records, which we hadn't played in a while. And I said, oops, those are it.
So here's another example of my process, because as it went along, it was clear we had such similar tastes. And I was really embarrassed because I felt that people would say, oh, she just likes whatever he tells her to like. And so when it came to Wire, I said, well, I'm not going to vote for Wire because then I'll look exactly like Bob. And that also happened with the Chuck Berry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, with a singles artist, you're looking for a compilation. And I think I wanted it to have, what's it called? We Too?
So, Bob, you voted for the definitive collection,
That's right. As opposed to the Ultimate Chuck Berry or some other name like that.
The definitive collection, I think, is a little longer than the Ultimate collection.
Yeah.
It has Promised Land and You Never Can Tell, which are not on the Great 28 and which are actually, not counting a few of the 50s ones, my very favorite Chuck Berry songs. And I love Chuck Berry. I worship Chuck Berry as an artist. Not a person, an artist.
The Great 28 was a double album that was around in the 80s. It replaced the multi-volume Chuck Berry's Golden Decade, volumes 1 through 3.
Right.
Carola, you voted for St. Louis to Liverpool.
Right. Because that was the one that I had bonded with. And
I played that for her when we were first together.
Yeah.
And it has We Too on it, which is a great song.
Yeah, right. It seemed right to me. And that's, again, one of those things where, well, what do you have a personal bond with? You know some things about that record because you're so bonded that you hear these little tiny things in it. So that's how that process went. What does it mean? One of the things in terms of list making that was running through my mind, I don't know when this was, there was some Rolling Stone, who is the best guitarist? And I happened to be having some kind of ENT in-office procedure. So I opened my mouth and the guy sticks a tube down my throat. And of course, I can't say anything. And he says, what is this with Jimi Hendrix is the greatest guitarist? What about Mark Knopfler? What is it with St. Louis to Liverpool versus, or whatever it is? So a lot of this stuff, it's just our opinions. So.
Well, yeah, but the difference between Chuck Berry and Mark Knopfler, those are widely divergent opinions. The difference between St. Louis and Liverpool in the definitive collection is one is more Chuck Berry songs and the other has fewer Chuck Berry songs. Knopfler and Hendrix, it's like, would you prefer needlepoint or sex? I mean...
Yeah.
Well, look, this whole question of judgment and of evaluation, when you're doing the 50 greatest albums of all time, as far as I'm concerned, and I think one way or another, though Carola may not articulate it in exactly the same way, it is a combination of, let's call it gravitas, and your own personal preference. There are albums I did not listen to that I voted for. I voted for Franco and Rosharo's Omona Wapi. I voted for Have Moisi, the fabulous Peter Stamfel, Jeffrey Fredericks, Michael Hurley record. I voted for MIA's Calla, even though MIA has turned into a complete fool, and maybe always was one. I didn't have to listen to Calla again, nor to The Roots How I Got Over, to know that those are two 21st century records that I absolutely adore, that I've played hundreds of times. Well, if there's anything, there's hundreds, but let's say many dozens of times. And I just have to trust my own ears and responses. And as for a critic, this question of balancing your own response with your objective appraisal, it's the job. And when you, especially compiling this sort of a list, you have to be able to do both. And so that's what we did. That's certainly what I did. I think it bothered Carola more than me because she doesn't do as much criticism. And I grade these things. And
Oh, we're going to get to that, Bob. We're going to get to that. But before we do, I want to ask some questions about things that are on your lists. You both voted for 2 Rolling Stones albums each. Now, you both have the Rolling Stones Now on your list. You share that. And then I think, Bob, you have Exile on Main Street on your list. And Carola, you have Let It Bleed.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Rolling Stones Now. What about this record makes it the clear choice over, say, Out of Our Heads or December's Children? 8 of the 12 songs on it are covers. That's kind of their ratio or formula for those 3 records. What makes you like Rolling Stones Now? Is it the where and when of your encounters with this music from way back when you first heard it?
Well, for one thing, the first 3 rock albums I bought it must have been early 65, were the Beatles' second album, which is also on my list, Rolling Stones Now, and Martha Reeves and the Vandellas Dance Party, which I don't even own anymore because it was one of those, I was a kid I loved Martha and the Vandellas. So yeah, I bought her album. And, as Berry Gordy always did, there was loads of filler on it, but I don't even own it anymore.
So that one does have Dancing in the Street on it, and it does have Nowhere to Run. Wow, side 2. Mobile Lil the Dancing Witch. I've never heard that one. And the umpteenth recording of Hitchhike. Okay, right. Keep going.
Carol and I have slightly different biographies. I said I was going to talk about this, and I want to. I'm 3 years older than her, but 4 years ahead of her in school. So in 65, I'm trying to be a journalist and beginning to glimpse the fact that I might write about popular music. Carola, on the other hand, is a junior or a senior at Radcliffe and fooling around with her girlfriends in the dorm room or whatever domicile they shared at that time. And for her, that's the reason she likes Meet the Beatles and I like the Beatles' second album, because Meet the Beatles was what she did with those friends, and the Beatles' second album is the one I bought. Both those cases, there are lots of covers on those records in both cases. And I think the early work of both of those fantastically great groups, one of the reasons it was so good was that they did that they picked out these songs and did new things with them. The version of Please Mr. Postman is by the Marvelettes, a masterpiece. The Beatles version is actually better. It's better. Goes out on this long fade. It's so wonderful. That sort of identification, that important Bildungsroman kind of identification when you're young, that in those decisions, it seems to me that those came in. This record changed my life. Of course I'm going to vote for it.
Well, Bob, I have to correct you a little, though. I think when I listened to early Stones, I didn't really distinguish whether I was hearing Rolling Stones Now or Out of Our Heads. I think I thought that Playing with Fire and Down Home Girl were on the same record and that kind of thing.
Right.
And as far as the Beatles go, well, they completely blew me away then. But until Rubber Soul, I wasn't really thinking, oh, which record is that? And I think that that's happened more since being with you. So we play one of those Beatles albums, I don't know, at Christmas or what. It's something, it's that kind of thing. I love them both.
There's no reason not to love them both. They're both great.
And same with the Stones album. But then with the later ones that we both have later ones on our list. Well, yeah, I knew you'd put Exile on. I think Exile on Main Street was over my head when I first heard it. I didn't understand.
And that's when Carol and I were first together.
No, we weren't. No, it was before.
I romanced you with a postcard from the Exile on Main Street package. I sent you a postcard.
Okay, but the album. But Let It Bleed completely got into my life. And again, this was a time when I don't know how many records. I had 8 records, a suitcase style record player. And I played Let It Bleed. I certainly played it every day. I'm wondering if I played it more than once a day. That time in 1970, my life had really
69,
changed.
I think it was.
But that's not when I was listening to it. I was listening to it.
Right.
And I just got into the women's movement, more actively political, and it seemed like there was danger and possibility of collapse everywhere. And that record said that to me.
It did. It did say that. It said that to me too.
Yeah. And so that's how that was for me. The second Beatle album that I put on my list, Rubber Soul. Okay, so I bonded with that my senior year at college. But then I began to think, well, is there any other reason that I bonded with it? And then I thought, well, that is the moment that the Beatles are recognizably artistic. I don't want to say arty, but it was really a different kind of record. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, Bob. Maybe you don't see it that way, but that's how it was to me.
I think the reason Rubber Soul has such a reputation is precisely for that reason. But when I play it up against Sgt. Pepper, which, was the greatest album of all time, and then people said, ooh, it is a little icky, isn't it? Well, I mean, I just happen to know that this was a record I always played with pleasure. We played it for our daughter, Nina, and it was Sgt. Pepper, not Rubber Soul, that turned her on, and that helped keep it alive for me. And I was very pleased to see that, although it was no longer number one, which would be silly, that it was towards the top of this list about which I have many other reservations, which we should get into, Joe. But at some point, we have to deal with the what's going on question. What's going on with what's going on anyway?
Okay, Bob, would you like to get into that right now? Shall we segue into that by your bringing it up?
What's Going On has 3 good songs on it. And why it is the greatest record of all time is some sort of concatenation of political correctness, memory of how great those 3 songs are, and they are titanically great. I am not saying they're not. What's Going On, Inner City Blues, and Mercy, Mercy Me. Those are great, great songs. But the rest of it is really absolutely second rate. With the strings by this guy I keep bringing up, David Van de Pitt, who, as near as I could tell, disappeared. Wasn't even a very important arranger in that world.
I just want to interrupt here to go back to the beginning when I said you didn't like this album, and you were like, well, it's all right. It's not that I don't like it. It's just not that great. I just want everyone listening to know, now you know why I said Bob doesn't like this record. Anyway, so
it's overrated. So overrated. It really does appall me that it has this reputation. I blame a lot of what I regard as the kind of more conventional choices at the top of the Rolling Stone list, and by the top I mean the top 50 or so, on the bizzers and artists who voted in this. Why, I obviously you have to respect their opinions, but exactly how much work they put into those opinions, I doubt that there was the kind of anything approaching the kind of work that Carola and I did. And I think that for the critics, it's a little different.
Well, Bob, to be clear, I'm not sure every critic put as much into this as you did.
No, I don't think so either, but I do think they take it more seriously. That's all I'm saying.
To be clear, the 2012 list compared to the 2020 list shows some big changes. Those changes, most notably in the top 10, Joni Mitchell jumps from number 30 to number 3, which I think signifies a change in the people.
And that is blue, right?
It's blue?
The record?
That's
yeah,
right.
We both voted for that record. Great record.
I think it shows that there's changes in who's voting, and also I think there's a groundswell of Joni Mitchell, not an underrated artist across the mists of time, but Joni Mitchell, I think, is viewed now as someone who is not given her due, which I don't disagree with. And so I think there's an impulse to get behind her and that record. Also moving up on the list, Prince's Purple Rain jumps from number 76 to number 8. And The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill jumps from number 314 to number 10.
I always thought that was an overrated record once again. And to be honest with you, I tried to find it and I seem to have lost the CD. I was going to play it again just to double check because I got to be wrong. I mean, you're saying a groundswell about Joni Mitchell. There's another kind of groundswell here too. People are coming to understand that women have always gotten the raw deal when this sort of evaluation procedure begins. And they're, in my opinion, compensating for that.
Okay. I would say that they've gotten the raw deal, as you put it, both as evaluators and evaluees.
Absolutely.
I don't know about compensating. I understand that you don't like The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill all that much. Having played it more recently than you have, I'll say it might be overrated, but it's not as overrated as What's Going On.
Oh, I don't think so either. It's a high B plus. I ended up giving it a B plus and not an A minus, and it was close.
And I have no beef with Joni Mitchell moving from number 30 to number 3 or number 30 to number 1 for that matter.
Not with that album. That album is just a stone masterpiece. There's no question about it.
Right.
Well, the thing about Lauryn Hill, and a lot of this stuff I didn't really have strong opinions about, but one of the standards that I thought about was impact. And that's a record that really had impact at a moment in history. Even if it isn't something I've connected with, I think it's good that it's up there on the list. It functioned that way in history.
There is another Marvin Gaye record that has had growing impact over time.
Here we go.
Carola, you voted for this record, and I was surprised to see it on your list. And it is Here, My Dear, Marvin Gaye's, I believe, 1979 album.
Which we were just listening to this morning.
There we go. So, Carola, what made you, is this a record that you've always liked, or is it one that you thought, I'd like to hear that again? Like, what about this record? It's a double album. It's his divorce album. It's lyrically strange and out of step with the rest of his catalog and possibly the rest of pop music. And musically, it's a little out of step, too.
Where to begin, Joe? Where to begin? At first, I thought, how am I going to explain this? Because what I think is, oh, God, it's so gorgeous. Well, my history with it, this was one of those records where I would say, what was that? What was that? I don't think I really responded to it. I mean, I didn't dislike it, but I wasn't noticing it. And then little by little, I'd hear funky space reincarnation. I begin to hear that at clubs between sets. That would be something somebody would play. And I said, well, what was that? And then little by little, I would hear some of the cuts, like the lead cut and some of the other ones for, I don't know when I would hear them. And I would say, okay, which Marvin Gaye record is that on? So part of the life I live in is I hear all this stuff and I don't know what it is. Little by little, I began to realize that this was all one album. I would ask to have it put on and Bob would say, you don't really want to be listening to that, do you? Because it's so long. But then when we were preparing our lists, I said, I have to listen to it completely through. I have to listen to it from beginning to end. So Bob put it on, and I remember I went and lay down in bed with a book and listened to it from beginning to end. And Bob came in and he said, all right, Carola, I can see how this would qualify for top 50 albums of all time. And I felt very proud. I think we listened to it that once and then we listened to it again this morning. The thing about it is it has these motifs that keep running through it. So there's the beginning when they're just meeting and they're young and there's some little motif. And then when he does anger later in, and it's all the progress of the breakup.
So this is telling the story of his romance and marriage to Anna Gordy, Berry Gordy's sister, and subsequent divorce. And the story on this is supposedly that he ended up making the record to generate money for the divorce settlement.
I believe the record was in the divorce settlement.
Yeah, the record was in the divorce settlement that she would get half the royalties.
Or maybe all of them.
Oh, maybe it was all of them. Well, whatever it was, he went into the recording studio saying, I am going to make the worst record I have ever made. And it's not going to do diddly squat. And she's not going to get a dime. And so he got in there, couldn't stop himself making it beautiful. He had a plan. I'm going to whatever. And
almost the whole thing was improvised.
I mean, he didn't come in with songs, as far as I understand. He just sat there and composed this stuff. It has a musical narrative. It starts off so smooth and gentle, and then it picks up. And what I was saying about on Anger, which is, I don't know where it is, like 6, I don't know what track it is, you hear that little motif come in the background from the early days. Whatever he's saying, the music is telling another story about regret and sadness and all this stuff. I could go on, but I just want to.
I think all this is true, by the way. I gave the record initially a B+. I wrote about the reissue and upped my review to an A-, which is where I now think it belongs. And everything Carol is saying is correct.
Well, thank you, Bob.
Whether that makes it one of the 50 greatest albums of all time is another question. But
yeah,
certainly has the stature and the originality that it's not crazy to put it there.
Well,
and it did finish in the top 500,
It did finish, sort of, yeah.
Around 493.
I'm proud of that. And listening to it again this morning, because I wanted to know which track did what happen on, I thought it sounded beautiful. Although about maybe 2/3 through, I thought, maybe I could take a break here. It is very long.
I can't blame you for taking a break. It's an album I never knew that well and never paid attention to as a whole until preparing for this. And it is a weird record. Lyrically, it's somewhere in between like a Jamaican toasting record and a late period Lenny Bruce album.
Yes. Yeah. And the album cover is so weird. It's a picture of Marvin Gaye as a Greek statue. And then I think there's some Rodin next to it, the Kiss, or I think that's
that's right. It's Rodin's The Lovers behind him. And then he's sort of got one hand outstretched, saying, here, my dear, here's your double album that
Is that right?
I finished just before descending into a cocaine addiction that appears to be one of the biggest and worst on the planet Earth.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. An album that some people were surprised to see on your list, and it's on both of yours, and I want to talk about it because it is one of my favorites as well, although I would not have thought to vote for it, and that is In a Special Way from DeBarge.
The other thing we're listening to this morning.
What makes this an A+, and what makes it a natural for your ballots?
We're talking about this breakfast thing. I would say the breakfast thing was at its height in the early 80s, just before we adopted our daughter, which meant that we were completely free to do whatever we wanted to in the morning. I've written about some of the singles that we played at that time in my memoir, but this was another one of those records. We just played it over and over and over again. The person who turned me onto this record is Nelson George, the great African-American critic who I worked with at The Voice, was one of the first people to publish him and became quite a good friend in the early 80s. And it was partly on his say-so that I began to listen to it, but then we just loved this record. It is an incredibly beautiful record. It's just beautiful from beginning to end. And the lead singer is Eldred DeBarge, and it's impossible to tell whether he's a man or a woman. You think that's right, Carola?
No, I don't think it's right, but I do think that sometimes we couldn't tell whether, well, I guess maybe this is a way of putting that. We couldn't tell who was singing, him or his sister. So
I believe that's Bunny. I believe it's his sister, Bunny.
Bunny, that's right.
Yeah, Bunny.
DeBarge are 5 siblings, probably the last of the great Motown groups. They come from Detroit. They recorded this record out in Los Angeles. This is the 3rd DeBarge album, and it has some big hits on it, although their huge hit, The Rhythm of the Night, their wedding or bar mitzvah or Sweet 16 classic, whatever you want to call it, that's on the album that comes after this. This record has... Stay With Me.
Baby, Would You Come Quick? Is that what it's called? That is the up-tempo one. It's almost none of it is up-tempo. It's almost all medium-tempo ballads with a lot of harmonies. And, Eldred DeBarge, the lead singer there, he had one of the great falsettos. He was up there with Philip Bailey, at least, of Earth, Wind and Fire. Although a little less fluid. He wasn't as much of a rhythm singer. He was more of a ballad singer, especially on this record. When he went solo, he became more of a rhythm singer, and he was good at that too, but not like this. This record is transcendent.
This record is a keyboard and bass record. The keyboards and bass define this song.
Keyboards are great, yeah.
And it is interesting, when I went to check
Is it still Jamerson? We were just talking about the bass playing.
When I went to check the personnel list, James Jamerson, the great Motown bassist of the Funk Brothers, who went from Detroit to Los Angeles when Motown moved from Detroit to Los Angeles. James Jamerson is on this record, although there are a number of other great bass players, including Reddy Freddie Washington, who is the guy who came up with the thumb-popping riff on Patrice Rushen's Forget-Me-Nots in 1982, the year before this.
I always wondered who that was.
So Ready Freddie Washington plays with Stevie Wonder, plays with Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, as well as Steely Dan.
Oh.
And there are a couple of guys on this record who are Los Angeles studio pros who either end up recording with or touring with Steely Dan. I think the drummer is a guy named Ricky Larson, who plays again for Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, plays on Whitney's I Will Always Love You, and turns up on Steely Dan's Two Against Nature. And it fascinates me that people lionize this kind of studio playing when Steely Dan are doing it.
Yeah.
And not so much
right.
These guys are doing it.
That's correct.
I had some of the thoughts I had about it. And I think there were a few years where we just happened not to listen to it. And then we started listening to it again. I think that's how it worked in our lives. When I first heard that people were getting so, why would you, Bob Dean, why would you put DeBarge on your list? And initially I got very hostile. Well, really, why wouldn't you? Then I just started to think, well, it is a falsettos record. Not altogether. I mean, he sings various things in various voices, but not everybody loves falsettos. I love the stylistics.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Really,
Carola is a
really
big Russell Tompkins fan.
Yeah. And so this has some of that quality on the high notes, but the songs themselves, well, I was talking about in Hanging Tree Guitar where everything sounded new, like you hadn't heard it before. Each song sounds really different from the other. And I'm saying each one. There's some not so much, but different kinds of structure. And some of them have that keyboard stuff you're talking about. And some of them, Eldred does a lower kind of a funkier vocal. Anyhow, it's a remarkable record, but maybe you don't like falsettos. I don't know.
Maybe this is off topic. We have a physical therapist. His name is Joe Spallone. He is a big ex-football player of remarkably left-wing politics and who loves music. And basically, he's a rock fan. Oh, I will say, however, he was one of the earliest Low Cut Connie fans. Once I played him their first record, he would go see them whenever he could. But long before he knew me, he was an owner of it in a special way. He loved it. And I thought, this guy, he is a rock guy, but he's got great ears and a great heart. To me, it's just one more proof of how terrific that record is. And also, I mean, I've gotten letters from young rock fans and even my contemporaries saying, gee, I thought you were crazy about that record, but I gave it a try. And you're right. I've gotten those letters.
I mean, just to be clear, DeBarge had hits. I knew DeBarge at this point because I Like It from the previous record was a hit. I saw them perform it on American Bandstand. And just as kids had in the 50s, I thought to myself, gee, I wonder if they have that at the record store. And went out and bought it. It was really, really good. And, this one has hits on it. It is a number one R&B record. It was on the radio. Stay With Me, I mentioned before, is famous to younger listeners as a Biggie sampled on the One More Chance remix. So, Bob, you've never heard that because you don't listen to the remix. But that was a number 2 hit from Ready to Die. It was in the air, literally, in the 80s, so it isn't a huge shock to me that someone would be a fan of it. So, Bob, I said we were going to talk about grades, and here it is. This is going to shock all of those people out there, and there are people out there who imagine that your grades are meant to constitute some invaluable canon, but your favorite Al Green record has changed over time. And
we just comparison played those two records a few days ago, thinking about this very question.
Okay, so the two records in question are Call Me, which was an A+ in the Consumer Guide in its day, and I'm Still in Love with You, which I believe was simply an A.
That's right. I'm Still in Love with You because, first of all, I was one of the first rock critics who loved Al Green. Thanks in part to the advice of an R&B critic named Aaron Fuchs, who I knew slightly and who's still around. I mean, I had already noticed it, but a phone call with him, we talked about it for a long time, and then I played it more, and that's when I really got into that was the first album. And Call Me, one reason I think Call Me was the one I said, oh yeah, this is great is because I was in favor of him being a little more up-tempo. One reason I liked the first album was that it had some of that stuff on it. And Call Me itself is one of his great up-tempo songs. But it happened to be on the stereo when I was convalescing from putting my back out. And the record played over and over again. And I really said, oh, yeah, well, finally, he's not just doing that soft stuff. But that was before I understood that Simply Beautiful, which is on I'm Still in Love with You, is a transcendent masterpiece, which has been done by Arto Lindsay, but also done by,
Mary J. rewrote it as PMS.
PMS. That's right. And also, before I really began to accept the fact that another one of his truly magnificent songs is unfortunately called Jesus is Waiting. Really, I'm an ex-Christian. I come from a Christian background that I have put a lot of work into rejecting. And so for me to love a song called Jesus is Waiting, it means it's really something. And it is really something. And just playing those records once again, Call Me sounded wonderful. It's an A album, for sure. Maybe not an A+. Whatever that means, really. But then I'm Still in Love with You, and I'm sorry, between Simply Beautiful and Jesus is Waiting, I wasn't quite crying, but I was spellbound listening to that for the 50th or 100th time.
So Simply Beautiful is on I'm Still in Love with You, and Jesus is Waiting is the last track on Call Me.
Oh, Jesus is Waiting is the last one on Call Me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just double checking now, and I see that I'm Still in Love with You has risen all the way from an A- to A+ territory.
That's right.
It is now in A+ territory, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Oh, do I have to answer that question?
Well, Bob, if you don't answer it now, there are dudes out there who are going to be emailing and tweeting at you saying, well, just to be clear, does this mean that this is now an A+? I just want to be clear. I need to be clear.
I dug myself such a big hole with that.
All right. So let's talk about two things here. So first, let's talk about this notion that people have that the grades are intended by you to constitute a canon as opposed to codify your personal opinion.
I've always tried to be as clear as possible to say that it's not simply about your personal opinion. There is objective judgment involved, but your personal opinion does enter into how you grade a record. At least it does me. Did I intend to create a canon? Only my own canon, not the canon. I don't believe in the canon. And why don't I believe in the canon? Because as the canon is now constituted by Rolling Stone, an overrated Marvin Gaye album is the greatest album of all time. Well, that's nuts. You have to respect your own opinion and the passion of your own response if you're going to be a good critic. But you also have to be able to make an admixture of that and your more detached judgment. There's judgment and there's taste. And if you would like to read more about this, my essay on Sonic Youth and my Is It Still Good to You collection is available from Duke University Press at this very moment.
Wow. Okay. Or do you have an 800 number you want to share? So the two things that people love to bring up is like every Black Sabbath album you review is a C- or a C. And first, I love the distinction between the C- and the C because, Paranoid is really bad. But We Sold Our Souls for Rock and Roll, it's just bad.
Now, look, it would be crazy for me to say, and I do not say, that Black Sabbath isn't an important group, but I'm sorry, I've tried. The last time I tried it, I was doing a radio show, sort of in the waning days of the Village Voice with a guy who loved Black Sabbath and actually went and bought me, I think it was a greatest hits record. So I would go and play it, and I did go and play it, and I'm sorry. It still didn't do it for me. And it has probably something to do with my own relationship with Christianity, which is very complex. Because Black Sabbath, it seems to me that one problem with them is that their relationship with Christianity isn't complex at all. But they do bring it up quite a bit, one way or another. I don't like metal, folks. My basic theory of metal is that its notion of what constitutes artistic quality is much too grounded in a European classical tradition in which I simply have no personal interest. And I've tried, and I've tried again. I just don't. Does that mean you shouldn't? Of course not. It doesn't mean you shouldn't. It means I don't.
Okay. I don't think Sabbath has that particular...
Not as much as some of the other metal bands, for sure. Not as much as Judas Priest, let us say. But there is a notion of grandeur having to do with loudness that goes back to the symphony orchestra. It does. You're right. I would say that generalization about metal applies much less to Sabbath than it does to other bands. I agree with that.
Sounds like something for breakfast listening, Bob.
Oh, no, please, no.
The other thing that people love to bring up is that you gave an A- to Marlo Thomas's Free to Be You and Me soundtrack.
Oh, what a terrific record.
Exactly.
Go fuck yourself, folks. I mean, really, you just don't like children. That's your problem, not mine. I love children. I love them. I always love little kids. Always.
So the thing people love to say is he gave an A- to Marlo Thomas's kids record and insert the name of their favorite record here, only got a B+. Although I will say, Bob, that when they start getting on you for giving Big Star's #1 record a B+ and Marlo Thomas an A-,
that was
I'm
wrong.
like, oh,
that was
okay.
wrong. That was wrong.
All right, there. So we've settled it.
Absolutely.
All right,
Big Star's at least an A-. Absolutely.
All right, so we've made some progress. Fantastic.
Dancer with Bruised Knees is a record we listened to a lot, but when we played it for auditioning it for this list.
Oh, you do remember playing it?
Yeah. We both felt I think we'd articulate it somewhat differently, that we loved it, but we didn't see it on this list. And when Joe, you emailed us, a few days ago saying, here's some things I might ask you about. And one of them was, why no Liz Phair?
Oh, yeah.
It was really interesting to think about the McGarrigles in that context, because my reaction to you saying, why not Liz Phair, was, oh my God, I should have put Liz Phair on. I was thinking, okay, well, I would take Memphis Jug Band off. You have to make it all add up. But the reasons were that Liz Phair, Exile and Guyville talk about impact. It really was history making in a lot of ways. She was a star right away. She was so smart, and she represented a kind of woman that you don't find that often in rock and roll. And because of all that, and the impact and the ground that she broke, that's rock and roll to me. Whereas the McGarrigles, it just sort of helped me define what was meant by great rock and roll albums. They weren't. Whereas I think, is that a folk record? Singer, songwriter, folk record? Maybe. And then I thought, well, freewheeling Bob Dylan, that is and isn't a folk record, because it's folk music, but it changed things when it came out. So anyhow, that's with the McGarrigles.
We played Exile and Guyville thinking about exactly this. And I think Carola said to herself, I should have put this on my list. And I didn't. And I realized that the reason I didn't really consider it was that it's a little thin musically. And
yeah, I hear you.
People who hate Liz Phair, that's what they say. Oh, that music is completely... There's some truth to that, but it doesn't really matter as far as how extraordinary the record is, and it's certainly an extraordinary record. It just wasn't quite good enough for me to think about.
Okay. I think its thinness is part of its virtue, and it is a record that...
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
And I think it's a record that has gained importance over time as it has been revalidated or reestablished in the last 5 years as an important record for an emerging group of women making indie rock.
Right.
I'm thinking here of Snail Mail, maybe Waxahachie. I mean, there are certain...
I'm going to say, boy, if you're responsible for Snail Mail, then get the fuck out of here.
Oh, I don't even know who they are, but I can smell the fire here.
I just want to remind everyone that only means that Bob thinks Snail Mail is overrated, not that he doesn't like her work.
No, I don't like her work in the case of Snail Mail.
Okay. All right. But I think Liz Phair has been claimed in the last 5 years as a enduring inspiration and influence. And what I'm trying to say is I think it is the sound of that record, the sound that she and Brad Wood came up with, that has also been very important in the way that these women go about making their records and the kind of sound they're after and the way that they think about the relationship between the music and the voice. And I think it's a very important record.
Now, if only they were as funny and as smart as Liz Phair, everything would be dandy.
Oh, Bob, get out while you're ahead.
Billie Eilish. That's a record that was on your listen to list, your long list. It did not make your ballot.
Yeah, what can I say? If it had been 75, it would have made my ballot, I think. It just didn't seem to have quite, and to a certain extent, for a recent record to gather that kind of, I don't want to use the term gravitas, it's just so wrong for how that record sounds and for what I really care about. But weight or importance, or Carola, can you help me here? You know what I'm saying.
Yeah, she fills the air. The air is different because you heard her voice. Is that anything like that?
And history has changed in some way. And it may well be true. In another piece I wrote, I said that record might very well be the best record ever made by someone who's 18 years old or a teenager, and by any teen.
Younger than 18 at the time. But yes, you did say that.
By a teenager. And that includes, unless maybe the Sun Sessions counts.
Yeah, crossed my mind. Yeah.
And well, I don't know. Do I like Billie Eilish better than the Sun Sessions? I think it's possible that I do, but I don't love Elvis quite as much as I'm supposed to, so that's part of the reason. Quite as much. I said quite as much.
Hey, listen, man, if you want to say that you like Billie Eilish more than the Sun Sessions, do it, because I do not believe that Grill Marcus is going to listen to this podcast.
How I felt about Billie Eilish, it wasn't like if the list was 75, it was more like if this was 2022, I needed her to sink in a little more.
I think that's a very good way of putting it, a better way than whatever I said. Yeah, it just didn't have the time to sink in. And as great as it is, it didn't quite have that kind of, I don't know what, sharpness.
I think it is an album somewhat like the Liz Phair album that will not just stand the test of time, but prove itself over time to be remarkably important, because it is the best of what I'm going to call genre agnostic music that's out there right now. Younger listeners who are coming at the whole of pop music history as a Spotify playlist and who are not distinguishing in their own heads between rock and hip hop. That's what I mean. There's a lot of great genre agnostic music out there right now.
Extremely well said, Joe. And I think that Billie Eilish epitomizes what you're talking about. And her brother.
And her brother.
And her brother, who is a great fucking producer. Great.
So the last thing I want to talk about is an album that made Carola's top 50 and not Bob's. And it is a record that I know about and I think I appreciate, not just because you were both enthusiastic about it, but you have played it in your house when I'm around, and that is the Beach Boys' Wild Honey.
Oh, yeah. I don't think we re-listened to that lately because we knew it well. Well, first of all, Darling is one of my 10 favorite songs.
We played Darling when Carola was just recovering from a stem cell. I give her an iPod, and that's the song we played, and we both sat there crying. The song really means a lot. And it was the Beach Boys record I played for Carola when we were first together.
So there's a lot of personal bonding with the record, certainly for me. But when I re-listen to it, I do find people who say that's their favorite Beach Boys album. That's how I feel about it. When I see Pet Sounds up high, I don't feel like, overrated. Bob me. I don't know.
I don't know either.
But I just love this. It's so deep. I don't mean in meaning. It's got such a deep sound in it. So, I really recommend it.
In 1977, The Voice asked me to do some sort of a consumer guide of the albums of 67. And to my surprise, the one I liked best was Wild Honey. I mean, I didn't expect that. And we are talking Sgt. Pepper in there. And I voted for Sgt. Pepper. I think Sgt. Pepper is a great record, remains a great record. Wild Honey is like both the Rolling Stones now and the Beatles' second album, although without actual covers on it. It's an album in which there was somewhat more R&B, discernible R&B influence than on almost anything else they ever recorded.
Right, because they cover Stevie Wonder on that record.
That's right.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. It's great.
Bob, so just placing that in your 67 pantheon. Also, the first Moby Grape record is a 67 record, which is one that you love.
Fabulous record.
There's no shortage of great records from 67, but there's also that Hollies record, the name of which I never remember, that is a favorite of yours from 67. I think the Hollies record in question is Evolution. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. just for those who are running to their Spotify right now or bidding up the price of it on Discogs. All right. Well, guys, this has been a great deal of fun for me, and I think we're going to stop here and maybe listen to some Beach Boys. Thank you both for being with us, and maybe we'll see you all again in a month.
I hope so.
Really? What are we going to talk about?
It was fun. It was definitely fun.
This is Robert Christgau. I'd like to thank my producers, Joe Levy and Sandy Smollins.
Audiation.